Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. This year marks the 17th anniversary of China's entry to the World Trade Organization. And this week, the WTO is carrying out the 7th review of China's trade policies. Could this review affect China's trade policies? Meanwhile, as the U.S. and China exchange the new tariffs, is the WTO in a position to prevent an all-out trade war? Before our panel, take a look at this first.
The China-U.S. trade war ramped up. On Tuesday, the U.S. announced it would slap a 10% tariff on an extra $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. China's foreign ministry criticized America's latest tariff threat, calling on other countries to oppose Washington's protectionism.
The new U.S. tariffs are typical trade bullying, and China will fight back to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. This is a fight between unilateralism and multilateralism, a fight between protectionism and free trade, and a fight between power and rules. China will stand with the international community to jointly defend free trade rules.
The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said Wednesday that it will lodge a complaint with the World Trade Organization on what it calls as U.S. unilateralism. Meanwhile, the WTO is carrying out its 7th review of China's trade policies and practices. Since entering to the WTO, China has contributed about 30% to world economic growth. The country has made big cuts to import tariffs, lowered non-tariff barriers, and liberalized the right to trade.
In 2001, as a new member of the WTO, we were a follower of international rules. And now we have grown to be a participator and also an upholder and contributor in the system.
The Commerce Ministry was quick to clarify that fulfilling China's WTO commitments has never been the end point of its opening up. China has committed to opening up wider and deeper to promote common development across the world and to achieve greater mutual benefit.
For more about the 7th WTO review of China's trade policies, with us in Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Jeff Moon, a former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. And also in Southampton, we have Mike Bastian, who is a professor at the University of Southampton. Welcome, Professor, as well. Let me begin by asking you, Professor Liu.
Yes.
The 7th review. Obviously, China just filed a complaint to the WTO on Friday about the U.S. punitive tariffs against Chinese goods. What do you make of China's performance over the 7 years and the recent, shall I say, drama, at least, going on between China and U.S.?
Well, China has really lived up to the WTO commitment as a developing country with 15 years of transition period of time. The fact that China has grown so fast, particularly in terms of its export drive, is really something that is beyond the calculation. Say 15 years ago when China joined the WTO, which is really deserved congratulations for China. But the fact also that China received many of those complaints in terms of anti-dumping, in terms of countervailing duties and also safeguarding measures. But China really moved forward with further opening its door and also deliver far more than the commitment that was made to WTO, particularly in terms of supporting the least developed countries by voluntarily reducing the tariff almost to zero.
Mr. Moon, China joined WTO. China has always been asking the question, particularly during the previous years, why China is still not being categorized as market economy status. That question has been asked repeatedly by China. Of course, now the timing has gone in a way, but still many question that whether it has been fair how China has been treated.
With regard to whether China is a market economy in fact, that simply is not the case. China was a state-led economy. It was brought into the WTO with the assumption that it would adopt reforms to become a market-led economy. But that really has not happened. There have been reforms, but China is still fully state-led. There are still 5-year plans. There are still enormous state-owned enterprises. There are many instances where the state, not the market, guides the outcome. And in fact, the Chinese government reflects as a matter of policy that the market needs to play a greater role in the Chinese economy. Now, with regard to the WTO definition, that reflects the assumption that China was going to become a market economy, and after 15 years, for purposes of that definition, China would be declared a market economy. But that does not mean that the facts on the ground mean that China really is a market economy. It's just not.
Okay, Professor Liu, if you have a plan, you are certainly a state-run economy?
For China to really evolve from the totally mandate planned economy to the present day where market plays such a crucial role, this is really not an easy job. And also China has benefited, and the whole world has really benefited. But the matter of state-owned firms, whether they really justify the market economy, that's really something very controversial. Because in many of the European countries who are considered to be fully market-driven economy, they still have state-owned firms instead of course, state-operated firms. So the fact that also China has made tremendous efforts to reduce the number of centrally owned state firms and try to introduce the proper modern management in terms of the governance is something that China is doing. But we cannot really ignore the historical legacy. A big bounce type of therapy to cure those or eliminate those state-owned firms may really send a big shock to the Chinese economy.
Okay, Professor Bastian, all of this debate, is it still relevant anymore when you have the largest economy in the world trying to levy heavy punitive tariffs on its trading partners, not just China, the EU countries, Canada, Mexico, and some of the others even being labeled as national threats?
The other two panelists' discussion about market economy status, if I can come to the American panelists, is a largely sterile debate. I mean, whether or not China can achieve market economy status isn't the issue, and reform is the issue, but it's not necessarily the same as privatization. The Chinese economy has made huge strides in becoming more competitive, and government intervention and government plans, I would say, are a big part of the success in the transition of the Chinese economy, and many European countries, the UK in particular, could learn from that. So reform and privatization is not really the way forward. I think the biggest achievement, the biggest issue from which the Americans and Trump in particular could learn are China's massive investment and positive impetus when it comes to regional integration and economic integration and the prospect of a real free trade area across the Asia-Pacific region, which will open up all sorts of opportunities for European companies, European consumers across the region. So the Americans really need to wake up.
Gentlemen, if you look at some of the things that's happening recently, the trade war, leading the World Trade Organization too, is it still going to be relevant as a result of that? Professor Bastian.
I think it's still most definitely relevant. It perhaps has to rethink its role, rethink its status, but certainly people now need to turn more so than ever to the World Trade Organization and look at a way out here, and there really needs to be some deep thinking, some critical creative thinking.
Well, that is perfect. That is perfectly understandable, but now you know better than I do, Professor Bastian. Even the judges that are supposed to be able to process some of the complaints filed by countries inside the WTO are not available to the extent of the number that should be there. And therefore, nothing can be done. So, and that, of course, was done by the United States on purpose. So, Professor Bastian, if you talk about improvement of the system, people have to be able to work together to improve the system, not just drag it apart. Professor.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're in uncharted waters here, particularly with Trump, but the WTO really is the body that needs to get people around the table. And if it means, and I think it probably will mean, more and more developed nations in effect coming together, uniting even more solidly behind the European governments, Germany in particular, and China, and rising Asian nations, almost against, in defiance of Trump, then so be it. And I suspect that's what will happen under the aura or the authority of the WTO. It's really a time to confront the Americans, I'm afraid, with this provocative, really internecine trade war that really is not going to do anybody any good, least of all the American public and American companies, who will suffer because so many of their businesses, supply chains, depend on imports from Asia and China.
Mr. Moon, what is your understanding of the current status? And is a midterm election in the United States, when it's changing the international trade system, how should we understand this?
Well, I strongly support the mission of the WTO, and I'm not here to defend the Trump administration or the tariffs, which I disagree with. Instead of thinking about how these tariffs are undermining the international system, we might think about how this is an opportunity to identify gaps in the WTO system and strengthen the WTO, because the fact is that almost all of the issues that are behind these tariffs, this is not a matter of tariffs for the sake of tariffs. The real issues on the table are frankly either not addressed or are inadequately addressed by the WTO, and that includes overcapacity, complex ownership restrictions, licensing discrimination, IPR, antitrust abuse, cyber intrusions, a whole range of issues that are out there. These are not covered by the WTO. And after almost 25 years, it's probably time to update the WTO and to include digital trade, which did not even exist in 1995.
But is creating a trade war the way to do it? That is the question, isn't it? I mean, when you talk about the percentage of the economy, yes, it might be just the 3% of the total trade, but the ill feelings created as a result of that, and the practice being used of levying punitive unilateral tariffs on the other trading partners. That is the problem, isn't it? And you think about it, your president on the Air Force One, and by the way, that is the president of America, whether you like him or not, that is the representative of the country. He talked about 34 billion, 16 billion, and then 200 billion and 300 billion more to come. That is coming from the president. So, Mr. Moon, there seems to be something that's really serious there. When you talk about WTO, it should be reformed, but at the same time, what about the things right now that are threatening the very existence of the platform WTO itself, Mr. Moon?
Well, the reason we're at this point is that, frankly, negotiations have been tried for many years, some of which I've actually participated in. For example, there was a global steel forum established a couple years ago under the G20 that has had little or no results. So in the press, there's talk about how the trade war just started. But actually, all of these issues have been on the table for many, many years without any resolution. And so that's why President Trump, I'm not justifying what he's doing, but I can explain that he's using the tools that are at his disposal. There are a handful of U.S. statutes that give him broad discretion, and that's why we are where we are. I would much prefer that we negotiate seriously and try to get serious rather than spoon-fed incremental progress with little overall impact.
Professor Liu, on the one hand, the elites say, oh, I don't agree with the president. On the other hand, the president just continued to do what he's doing right now, which is creating threats to the international trade system. And the elites, they're saying, well, let's negotiate. So it's both carrots and sticks at the same time. I'm not even seeing much of the carrots yet. Professor Liu, how would you respond to your American colleague?
Trade war is imminent, but the WTO is really they're in a crucial stage for reform. For example, you know, when WTO is only legitimizing the countermeasures against the punitive tariff if they are justified, but the fact that they are short of the compulsory enforcement, so that's a major defect. And there's no even collective action that can really be legitimized among other complaining countries. And also that the U.S., the unilateral decision is really disrupting the entire global trade order, particularly when it really taking place more heavily between the two biggest economies. So that can be a major concern. That can really cause a lot of you know, the negative feeling among all the trading members around the globe. So therefore, to defend and reform the WTO, particularly in the dispute settlement mechanism, followed by a stronger enforcement mechanism. Right. So that is the necessary part.
Professor Bastian, you want to put your thoughts here too?
I think reform is essential. I agree with the other panelists, but I think the Americans, and Trump in particular, are boxing themselves into a corner. So if and when reform does take place and the WTO takes on a new position and improves the mechanism by which trade resolution is achieved, the Americans probably will not take center stage. So they're really in danger of putting themselves out of place totally. So I think the American people need to wake up to the fact that they need to do something about this rogue president.
Mr. Moon, I do have a question. It's a question about how in modern world discussions should take place. Is it about I'm the biggest trading nation in the world, I buy your products, and therefore I have to say about how things will go. You just listen to me. Otherwise, I punish you. And if I want to change the system, I will just change the system, whether you like it or not. Or is it about so-called multilateral system in which everybody should have a say to a certain extent, but eventually there has to be a consensus. Can consensus be established under threat, or can consensus be established under discussion? That is a very important question after World War II, right, Mr. Moon?
Of course. I'm a multilateralist and a free trader, and I much prefer the WTO approach, and I prefer international consensus. My only point was that I think the Trump administration has concluded that efforts in that regard have led us to a dead end.
Mr. Moon, I caught some of the key words you just said. I know, once again, you don't represent the current administration in the White House, but you suggest that possibly the Trump administration has concluded that earlier discussions, consensus building, is not going to work, and that is what it's doing right now, which is taking the other way forward. So if that is the case, well, the others do not necessarily going to agree with that. What would that mean to the international trade system once again? Or the other parties, when they do not necessarily agree with Trump administration's approach, what can they do? Are they going to seek other ways out? Are they going to do something without the U.S. participation? Or are they going to dismiss whatever the U.S. is trying to say because the U.S. already violated what they consider as the international norm and the international rules? So that is an interesting question, isn't it? Professor Bastian, from an academic perspective, how do you see the potential there?
How this will play out is very difficult to see at this stage. I think it comes down to one or two European leaders really getting behind a few more, getting China on side, and really confronting the Americans. I think that really has to be the way forward. There can be no sort of soft touches here. So academically, from a business perspective, they roll into one, really. We've got to confront the Americans.
I'm not sure whether people should really choose their side as the solution. But it's up for debate. Mr. Moon, the question is, how is the United States going to handle its trade relations in the future within the WTO framework, which the U.S. is benefiting right now, which you are still doing it and benefiting from it right now? For example, with Canada, for example, with Mexico, for example, with Germany, for example, with China, in which countries' punitive tariffs have been levied on these countries. And also these countries, to a certain extent, have also retaliated in kind. So, Mr. Moon, how will that discussion be like for the future?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of interpreting what the United States may or may not do, I would separate out the political statements from the economic facts. I think China's done a very good job of that, ignoring tweets and ignoring political rhetoric and trying to get right down to the facts. And I think that a lot of what the art of the deal for Trump is to try to get leverage through surprise by taking maximalist positions, but always thinking about his domestic constituency and the short term. And if you remember that, then what he is doing makes sense. I think in the longer term, there need to be, and there will be, discussions between the U.S. and China. We have resolved all kinds of issues over the years, and we will resolve this one. There will be discussions, and I think the solution, at least with regard to China, is to take China at its word that it wants to open up and further deepen its relations with foreign countries, and we need to take those openings to make meaningful changes in terms of not just legal access, but effective access.
Okay,
to the
Professor
Chinese
Liu,
economy.
before we
That's
go
what's been
very
lacking.
okay, Professor Liu, before we go very briefly from you.
Well, still, you know, the one is really countries need to rally together to defend the multilateral trading system, and particularly the dispute settlement mechanism.
Okay.
And the other is that I try to grow your muscles stronger in terms of economy so that you can really counterbalance. And third is that we need to work together with many other, you know, the complaining countries.
Professor Bastian, final words.
The defense of multilateralism is key. That's what's at stake here. That's what we need to put first. Multilateralism, not unilateralism and protectionism.
Mike Bastian, Jeff Moon, Liu Baocheng, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us from your own perspective, sharing with us your insights. Really appreciate it.